A very good afternoon to all the participants again. We welcome you here again for the webinar number 2 of the series of the webinars that we are holding for the international relations as part of the International Relations book, the third edition. My name is Pavneet and I am the author of the book International Relations, which has been published by McGraw-Hill. And the book has just recently come out with the third edition. And as part of the third edition, we are providing you with these webinars as a supplementary feature for the book. So without wasting time, let us go to the topic number 2 that we have for today, which is the topic called the Indian foreign policy. Okay. Now, when we look at the Indian foreign policy, you see there are various things to be kept in mind. Whenever we start the study of any foreign policy of any country, we often begin by studying the past or the ancient times. You know why ancient times or the past is very important in the study of foreign policy is because there are various reasons in which it helps us to understand the present and the future behavior. So, for example, if we try to study past of a country in a specific way, then by analyzing the past of the country, we will be able to ascertain two things. The first thing we will be able to ascertain is the present day behavior of the country. Any country that behaves in a specific way today displays that behavior today because that country has displayed a specific behavior in the past also. So that means the past behavior is a crucial factor in understanding the present day behavior of the state today. So one thing is very clear here, that what is the relevance of past? Number one, the first relevance of past is that it helps us to understand the present day behavior today. Number two, why do we also study the past? We also study the past because the past behavior of a country can not only help us to understand the present day behavior today, but the past also can help us to predict the future behavior tomorrow. Now, why is it stated so? It is stated so primarily because that if a country has behaved in a specific manner in the past, we will be able to predict its behavior today. And the way the country behaves today, which is influenced by its past, will also help us to predict the behavior of the country in the future. So one thing is very clear, that the relevance of ancient history in the foreign policy at the contemporary times is that in the foreign policy analysis, it helps us to understand the present day behavior and predict the future behavior. Now, keeping this basic idea and the basic aspect in mind, let us try to understand that how does Ramayana, which is an ancient Indian epic, have basically relevance in the contemporary foreign policy today. So we are going to study Ramayana basically through a case study methodology. In a case study methodology, what we are going to do is that we are going to have certain case objectives. So first and foremost, what is our case objective for Ramayana and Indian foreign policy? Our case objective here is to see or analyze that whether this ancient Indian epic called Ramayana, does it have anything relevant for our foreign policy today or no? And if Ramayana, which is an ancient Indian epic, if we are able to analyze that it has certain relevance for the Indian foreign policy today, then we will also try to ascertain what that relevance is and how does it help our foreign policy in the present times. Now, in order to understand this case study of Ramayana, we will have four major case actors. The four major case actors that we are going to use in this particular case study include number 1, Lord Ram, number 2, Sita, number 3, Hanuman, and number 4 is basically Ravan. So we are going to have four case actors, Ram, Sita, Hanuman, and Ravan. Now, keeping this in mind, let us try to analyze this case study and try to keep the objective of the case in mind, that we are trying to look at the relevance of Ramayana in Indian foreign policy today. Now, as we all know the plot of Ramayana, in the plot of Ramayana, what happened? The first thing that happened was basically that Sita was kidnapped. She was abducted and taken away to Sri Lanka by Ravan. And as she was taken away by Ravan, Ram was very visibly upset and he was missing Sita also. So he entrusted the responsibility to locate Sita on his trusted friend called Hanuman. Now when Ram told Hanuman that Hanuman, you have to locate Sita, Hanuman at that time had a lot of difficulty because the time period we are referring to is an ancient time period when we did not have the GPS technology and other things which were there. But Hanuman, as a good friend of Ram, decided to undertake the task with full sincerity and dedication. So Hanuman started locating Sita, and after a great difficulty, we know one thing, that Hanuman was also able to locate Sita finally in the present day Sri Lanka. Now when he was able to locate Sita, what happened at that time? At that time, the first objective of Hanuman was to convince Sita, to convince her that he has been sent by Ram and he is not an agent of Ravan, because Sita had to be convinced that Ram has sent Hanuman to locate her. So thereby, as the story of Ramayana unfolds, and as we know that when Hanuman is able to locate Sita, Hanuman tries to convince Sita that he has been sent by Ram and not by Ravan. Eventually, after a lot of discussion and convincing activity, we also know that Sita finally gets convinced. Now when Sita gets convinced, what does Sita do? As the story of Ramayana tells us very clearly, Sita basically gives a message to Hanuman. And Sita tells Hanuman that please give this message that I am giving you to Ram when you go back and meet him. What does Hanuman do in the story of Ramayana? He takes the message from Sita. He comes back from Sri Lanka to India. And when he comes back to India, he gives the message to Ram. He gives the message to Lord Ram and tells Lord Ram that, see, this is the message that Sita had to give me for you. You see, this is what in the present times even the diplomats happen to do. What do diplomats do? If you just try to draw an analogy from whatever we have discussed now, the idea becomes very clear. In the modern times, the diplomats are also sent from one state to the other state. Why are they sent to the other state? They are sent to the other state to collect information regarding events in the other state. These diplomats, after they collect the information from the other state, write down that information and give the information in a truthful manner back to their home state. So for example, if you try to draw an analogy, what Hanuman did was precisely an activity what was also done by a diplomat today. That he also went from one place to the other, which was from India to Sri Lanka, though his objective was to locate Sita. Secondly, Sita gave a message to Hanuman. Hanuman got the message and gave it back to Ram. The diplomats also happen to do the same thing, that they collect information from the state where they are posted, and therefore they are able to present that information back home to the different departments, ministries, etc. So one thing is very clear, that the first objective in this case study, which was basically to the undertaking of the search of Sita, has given us a deduction that what Hanuman did is what precisely diplomats do today. And what Hanuman did was that he merely acted as an information agent of carrying information from Sita and bringing it back to Ram. And that is what precisely diplomats do today, who are also known as information agents. So deduction number one from the case is very clear, that there is a clear-cut analogy we are able to draw between the modern day diplomats and the activity carried out by Hanuman at that time, where both of them acted as information agents. Proceeding further. Now you see, let us continue with the story of Ramayana. So Hanuman came back, he gave the message to Ram. Ram is very happy. Ram is happy that Sita has been located. So what does Ram do now in the story of Ramayana? Ram basically now tells Hanuman to go to Sri Lanka, and he tells Hanuman to get Sita liberated. So now what happens? Now basically Hanuman goes back to Sri Lanka. Hanuman goes back to Sri Lanka, now meets Ravan, stands in the court of Ravan, meets him. Now his objective obviously is very different this time during the visit. He is not locating Sita, but he has gone there to get Sita liberated. So now what happens at this time is that when Hanuman encounters Ravan and when he meets Ravan in his court, the first thing that he tries to do is, as the story of Ramayana only tells us, is that he tries to project the power of Ram. He tries to project the power of Ram by telling Ravan that Ram is a very popular leader back home. He tells Ravan that Ram is a person who has a great followership back home. He tries to tell Ravan that Ram has a very big fort in which he lives. He has a great popularity amongst the people of the country. So what is basically Hanuman trying to do? In a one single word, Hanuman is trying to undertake what is called as power projection. Power projection means that he is trying to project power of an individual. And that individual in concern here is basically Lord Ram. And he is trying to project power of Lord Ram in front of another individual whose name is Ravan. You see, please remember one thing, that in the ancient times, most of the time period we observed that at that time power projection was individual in nature. What is the meaning of this word here? That power projection, whenever it happened earlier, was done of an individual, of a person. So person here is whom? Ram, whose power is being projected by whom? Hanuman. And Hanuman is projecting the power in front of whom? Another individual, as we just said, whose name is Ravan. So in the ancient times, I'll give you another example. You know, the Cholas. If you read the ancient history, you must have heard about the Cholas. The Cholas had a great diplomatic activity with Southeast Asian countries. They would send their diplomats to Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. And you know, most of the times, what these Chola diplomats would do, they would go to the foreign states and they would project power of their Chola kings who had sent them. They would exaggerate their accounts by saying that my king has 60,000 elephants, my king has these big forts, etc. So they would project power. And what would they project power of? Of an individual. Please remember that. That is what Hanuman is trying to do here, that he is projecting power of an individual called Ram in front of Rama. Now, please also remember one more thing, that in the foreign policy of the present day times, power projection also continues. Power projection has never stopped. But the only thing that has happened today is that the nature of power projection has changed. Today, we don't have ancient time periods anymore. In the modern times today, we have modern day nation states. These modern day nation states were established after the Peace of Westphalia. So most of these modern day nation states, which are sovereign countries or sovereign entities in the international system that we have today, they do power projection. And the power projection that they do is not of any individual, but the power projection that they do is the projection of their own country's potential. So power projection is something that continues. What I am trying to tell you is that power projection was done by Hanuman also. And power projection is done by countries even today. So for example, Indian Prime Minister, whenever he happens to visit abroad, thanks to the corona crisis these days, we see that our Prime Minister is unfortunately not able to go abroad, but otherwise we know how fond he is. But when he tries to go abroad, why does he go abroad? He goes abroad to different countries to basically project India's power. He tries to project India's power, that India is a viable investment destination. If he goes to a European country, he will try to position India as an investment destination. Why? Because European countries are basically countries which are rich. They have a lot of monetary potential that they can undertake investments in India. So what will our Prime Minister do if he visits Europe? He will project our economic potential. Similarly, if our Prime Minister goes to the US, what will he do there? He will also try to project India's power there. But because the US is a different kind of a country that requires Indians in a different way, we will do power projection also differently. So for example, if we go to US, we will try to tell US at that time that, see, you people have a lot of money, but how to utilize that money is something you do not know. And we have trained technical manpower. Why? Because manpower is India's natural resource also. So we will try to tell the Americans that, see, with our trained manpower, you can try to take advantage and enter into agreements with us which can help you also grow and help us also grow. So both, if India and US happen to sign an agreement, what will happen eventually? India will be able to successfully project power in the US also. So what I am trying to say is that power projection continues. And power projection, which began with Hanuman, is continuously being visible even today to us. That is the idea that we are looking at here. Similarly, if you take another example of power projection in the present times, as we talked about US, as we talked about Europe. Now let's say if our Prime Minister goes to, say, Afghanistan. If India's Prime Minister visits Afghanistan, what kind of power projection will he do there? He will try to project India's power in Afghanistan as a credible provider of security, as a credible provider of what we call as development administration. So the idea is that different countries have different requirements. So we analyze that and carry out the power projection differently there. So one thing is very clear, that power projection, which was basically something visible in the Ramayana, where Hanuman projected power of Ram in front of Ravan, is something that continues even today. That is what we are trying to say here. Now, proceeding further, in the in the story of Ramayana, when what happens now in the story of Ramayana, when we see that Hanuman is doing power projection of Ram in front of Ravan, Ravan gets very angry at that time. And when Ravan gets very angry at that time, what does Ravan do in the story of Ramayana? We know one thing, that Ravan, when he gets very angry with Hanuman, he orders that Hanuman should be put to death. Now, the moment Ravan says that Hanuman should be put to death, the story of Ramayana takes a different twist altogether. And what is that twist? The twist is very clear, that the moment Ravan says that Hanuman should be put to death, Ravan's brother comes there. And Ravan's brother, when he comes there on the scene, he says ki Ravan, no, Hanuman cannot be put to death. And he intervenes and says that the reason why Hanuman cannot be put to death is because he says that Hanuman has come from a foreign state. And because he has come from a foreign state, he cannot be killed. He has to be allowed to go back. And because of the intervention of Ravan's brother, we know one thing in the story of Ramayana, that Hanuman eventually escaped and he came back to India. Now, if Hanuman escaped, he escaped because of the intervention of Ravan's brother. And that intervention of Ravan's brother is nothing but a clear-cut example of diplomatic immunity enjoyed by Hanuman of going to a foreign state. So one thing is very clear here in this particular discussion also, that the anger of Ravan brings the intervention of Ravan's brother. And with the intervention of Ravan's brother invokes the principle of diplomatic immunity to allow Hanuman to go back. And see the beauty. If Hanuman enjoyed diplomatic immunity of coming from a foreign state and he came back, one thing is very clear also, that the principle of diplomatic immunity continues to be a tool of diplomacy even today. Even today in the present day times, the principle of diplomatic immunity is one of the cornerstones of the modern day contemporary diplomacy. So, it can also be stated that this principle of diplomatic immunity, which we visibly see in the world today, is ironically seen for the first time in the ancient Indian epic called Ramayana. This also proves us one very important thing, that India has also contributed to the development of diplomatic history in the world. So one thing is very clear here, that the entire case study of Ramayana very clearly tells us three things. The case study tells us, number one, that countries continue to do power projection, though power projection, which was earlier in the ancient times individualistic in nature, is basically now about the economic potential of the country. Number two, countries continue to undertake the practice of diplomatic immunity, and this principle of diplomatic immunity is something which was seen for the first time during the case study of Ramayana itself. And at the same time, one thing is also very clear through the case study of Ramayana, that diplomats are basically information agents, and that is what precisely Hanuman also visibly was, as we have seen in the case study. So one thing is now very clear. What is the final case conclusion here? The final case conclusion that we can very easily draw is that it is not wrong to say that Hanuman is India's first diplomat, or Hanuman is India's most ancient diplomat, and continues to power the diplomacy in our present day times also. So one thing is very clear, this entire case study has helped us to analyze the relevance of past and the present day foreign policy, and through three learnings that we have derived, the conclusion that we can draw in the case is that Hanuman, being India's ancient diplomat, and Ramayana as an ancient epic, does provide us tremendous amount of knowledge that gets applicable to the modern day diplomacy today. So keeping this in mind, let us proceed further. Now, if we try to study the foreign policy in the modern times, coming from the ancient times and taking a jump directly from the ancient times to the modern times, one thing is very clear, that in the modern times, we can basically start our study of the foreign policy from the period of the end of the World War II. Now you see, first thing is that when we try to trace the origin of the Indian foreign policy at the end of the World War II, there are three observations. So, without going into too much of technical details here, the world witnessed a World War One. The World War One, which began in 1913, got over by 1918, and finally there were agreements signed in 1919 and 20 that led to the ending of the World War One officially. But it is often stated that the way World War One was resolved created the foundation for the World War Two. That means there was a faulty way of resolving the World War One. We don't need to go into the technicalities as of now, but just keep that in mind that the way the World War One was resolved created the foundation for the World War Two. This means that World War Two was inevitable because of the way the World War One was finally concluded. So there were various conditions that were created for many states to become aggressive again after the end of the World War One, and as a result of which the world witnessed a World War Two. Now, the World War Two came to an end in 1945. This is an important year that you need to remember. Now, in 1945, when the World War Two came to an end, as I just said, if the World War One happened in 1913 and the World War Two happened starting from 1939 to 1945, within a short span of 40-45 years, the world witnessed two devastating wars. And because the world witnessed two devastating wars, after the World War II came to an end, the first observation is that we need to remember that the world after the end of the World War II decided through a global consensus that we will basically prevent a World War III. So this is the first thing you need to remember. That after the World War II got over, which got over in 1945, there was a global consensus, and the global consensus was that the world has to prevent a World War III. So global consensus means that almost every country in the world at that time basically was concerned enough to prevent another world war. Because a world war leads to a lot of devastation of men, material and money. So countries were almost very frustrated. So they wanted to prevent a World War III. To prevent a World War III, there was a global consensus. Number one. Number two, how did this global consensus manifest? That means that if you have clarity that we will prevent a World War III, the question is how do you intend to prevent it? So the countries in the world said that fine, as we have decided that we will not have a World War III, to prevent a World War III, they created a common institution at that time called the UN or the United Nations. So United Nations was born in 1945. Please remember the year very importantly. United Nations was born in 1945 with the objective of basically preparing the world to prevent a World War III. You see, one thing is very important here. We are not discussing in detail UN right now, nor are we having a webinar on UN. But just keep one thing in mind, that one of the objectives, not the sole, but one of the objectives of the UN when it was created was to prevent a World War III. Whether UN has been successful in preventing a World War III or not is not a matter of debate. And why it is not a matter of debate? Primarily because the UN has not allowed a world war to happen. But that does not mean that, after the end of the World War II, wars only have not happened. Many wars have happened. That is why I am saying we are not debating the idea that whether UN has been successful in preventing wars or no. Our concern is whether UN has been successful in preventing a world war. Yes, 100%. So there is no world war as of now. And to that extent, the credibility of UN remains intact. That's the first observation. Let's proceed further. Second observation is birth of USSR and USS superpowers. Okay. So now, after the World War II got over, US and USSR, the Soviet Union or Russia in simple language, US and USSR basically emerged as two superpowers. You see, what are superpowers? Superpowers are countries which are economically, politically, and militarily powerful. Please remember this definition. The definition is in a simple language. See, we are not looking at it from the political science perspective, but from a general perspective that you will use in the GS. That countries which are superpowers are economically, politically, and militarily powerful. After the end of the World War II, a situation in the world got created, and the situation was that we had US and USSR as two superpowers. They were economically powerful, they were politically strong, and they were militarily strong. Now you see, the problem is that just now in the first observation we said that countries in the world had a global consensus to prevent a World War III. But you know, how do you prevent a World War III when you have some superpowers who are economically, politically, and militarily powerful? That means some kind of problem is going to be there. So what is the problem? The problem with a superpower is that any country which is economically strong, politically stable, and militarily strong is likely to dominate. That is why if you look at the point number 4 of the observation number 2 in the slide, the quest for dominance. What is the quest for dominance here mean? The quest for dominance here means a very simple thing, that any country which is a superpower, and again I repeat, a superpower, please get this deep in your brain. A country which is superpower is one which is economically strong, politically stable, and militarily strong. Such a country which is a superpower is likely to dominate and is likely to display a behavior of dominance in the world. Dominance. Now the question is, what does the word dominance, dominate mean? In international relations, the word dominance or dominate means a quest to control the behavior of another state. Please understand this again very carefully. When you try to dominate somebody, you try to control the behavior of somebody. This happens very frequently even in your houses. In houses, somebody or the other is likely to be a dominant figure, as we say. In most of the cases, it is basically the father who is the dominant figure, but sometimes even the mother becomes dominant. And if the father, mother both are dominant, then the world war at the home also is very likely possible. So one thing is very clear. Any time, whenever we use the word dominance, dominance means an ability of a country to control the behavior of the other state. Now you see, please remember, which country can control the behavior of the other state? Only a country which is a superpower. And why? Because a superpower is a one which is economically strong, has the economic power to control your behavior. It is militarily strong, has the military power to control your behavior. So for any country to dominate in the international system, please remember very carefully, friends, that dominance is only possible by superpowers. Nepal can never dominate. Nepal cannot manufacture a toothbrush also. So one thing is very clear, that in order to dominate, the domination happens only possibly with a superpower. Keep this in mind and let's proceed to the observation number 3. As we said, the problem in the world was that at the end of the World War II, what happened? At the end of the World War II, the world wanted to prevent a World War III. But the world basically was such that at the end of the World War II, Russia and US emerged as two superpowers. And because both of them were now two superpowers, both of them wanted to dominate. And as both of them wanted to dominate, because they were economically powerful, militarily powerful, their quest for dominance led to a superpower rivalry. A superpower rivalry is a rivalry between two dominating powers, between two superpowers. So Russia said that I am economically, politically, and militarily strong. I want to dominate the world. US said, no, even I am, economically, politically, and militarily powerful. I want to dominate the world. Now the problem is very clear, sir. If both Russia and US try to dominate the world, and by the way, I have just told you what is the meaning of the word dominate. The word dominate means if both of them try to control the behavior of other countries in the world, what will happen? There will be a rivalry. Rivalry means that they can have clashes. Clashes means that if they have clashes, such a clash can lead to a fight. And if such a clash leads to a fight, that means that there can be a World War III. So that means this is a problem. And what is the problem? Again, I'll go back to the previous slide once more. Please understand this carefully. A superpower will have a sense of dominance. I go further. And a sense of dominance creates a sense of rivalry. And rivalry leads to instability. Instability happens because of a potential clash possible. And if there is an instability, I go back again, see the observation number 1. If there is an instability or a clash, what will happen? The global consensus gets violated. And what is the global consensus? No World War III. So keeping all this thing in mind, both Russia and US did a very mature thing. In 1945 itself, both of them came out with a formal announcement. A formal announcement that both Russia and US made in 1945 was that we both are superpowers. We both have a quest for dominance. Our dominance is likely to lead to a superpower rivalry. Such a rivalry is likely to lead to instability in the world. Therefore, we have both decided that we will prevent this instability in the world. Again, please remember, sir, this is a formal announcement happening by Russia and US in 1945. Sir, Cold War का origin जो है, it is slightly complex and technical. Please understand it carefully. Otherwise, you will have a lot of difficulty in understanding it. I repeat again once more quickly so that the things fall in place for you. There is a rise of superpowers at the end of the World War II. The superpowers have a quest for dominance. They are superpowers because they are economically, politically, militarily strong. They have a quest for dominance means that they want to control the behavior of other states in the world. Both Russia and US realize that as they try to manifest their quest for dominance, it will lead to a superpower rivalry. This rivalry will lead to instability. Instability will be caused because of a clash, and such a clash that may happen as the two try to dominate the world will lead to basically a violation of the global consensus that Russia and US just decided to achieve, or the world decided to achieve. So what do Russia and US do in 1945? They make a formal announcement. And in that formal announcement, what do they tell each other? They not only tell each other, but they tell the entire world. 1. We will not undertake any military fight with each other. So Russia and US make a very important, mature, formal announcement. And the formal announcement that they make is that we both are not going to undertake a military fight with each other. Now please remember, if they don't undertake a military fight with each other, what will happen? What will happen is that eventually there will be rivalry which will not undertake a military manifestation. So if Russia and US will militarily not fight, there will be a sense of stability at least. Now the question is, why did Russia and US say that we will militarily not fight with each other? Please remember, they said that we will not militarily fight with each other because we want to maintain world peace. And we want to maintain world peace because we are two superpowers. And countries in the world look up to us as superpowers. And we are superpowers, and not only countries in the world look up to us, but by the virtue of being superpowers, we have a moral responsibility to maintain world peace. So there is a moral angle involved here also. The idea is very simple, sir. Russia and US are two superpowers. Try to perceive them in a simple language as elders in the house. If they are elders in the house, they will command some respect. If they are elders in the house, people in the house will look up to them for moral values. Same way, in the international system, Russia and US are two superpowers. They said that if we both start fighting, our friends and followers will also start fighting. And if everybody starts fighting, what will happen? World War III will happen, which we cannot afford to happen at this time. So what do? Both Russia and US said that we are two elders. One is Chacha, one is Taya. We will not fight. And if we will not fight, we will not slap each other. We will peacefully live with each other. And if we will avoid a military confrontation, what will eventually happen is that we will be able to maintain world peace. So the third observation is very clear, that there is a formal announcement by the Russians and the Americans at the end of the World War II. That announcement is that both the Russians and the US decide that we will militarily not fight. They are militarily not fighting not because they don't have the capability to fight, sir. Please remember, as I have said earlier also, that Russia and US are not militarily fighting only because they want to maintain world peace, because they have a moral responsibility for world peace. They are not fighting not because they don't have the capability. They are superpowers. They have tremendous capability to fight. They can decimate, destroy anybody on this earth. So one thing is very clear. They have decided not to fight only because of a moral responsibility. Now, one thing is very clear. With this formal announcement, the world was also having a sense of relief that the two big superpowers have said we will not fight. The two big superpowers have said we will cooperate as much as possible with each other. But this relief was very temporary. Why? Because even if Russia and US said that we will militarily not fight, the problem was the urge to fight continued. And this urge to fight which continued created the trouble. You see, it is very similar to human behavior if you observe. Now we are just about to witness New Year. On New Year, many people will make a resolution. From 1st January, I will not do smoking. Only 1st January will be the day he will not smoke. Urge to smoke will still remain there. He will start smoking again from 2nd January. And this is the same problem that happened even with the superpowers here. What was the problem? Problem was that they both officially said militarily we will not fight. Now because they have officially announced it, obviously they have to avoid a military confrontation. But the problem is the urge to fight continued. And how did that urge to fight that continued manifest? It manifested in the form of a Cold War. And what is a Cold War? Cold War, if we proceed to the next slide, will now become clear. Cold War was a situation where there was no war, yet there was no peace. So the definition of Cold War is very simple, sir. It is a situation where there is no war, yet there is no peace. I hope you understand this. There is no war. The first part of the definition says there is no war, and the reason why there is no war is because at that time, Russia and US have just now made a formal announcement. And the announcement that they have made is that we are not going to militarily fight. That is the reason why there is no war. Yet there is no peace. That is the second part of the definition. Why there is no peace? There is no peace primarily because the urge to fight continues. And as the urge to fight continues, both Russia and US now say that as we cannot fight militarily, we will fight ideologically. They decided to undertake what is called as an ideological clash. Now the question is, why did they try to go for an ideological clash? They decided to go for an ideological clash primarily because Russia and US ideologically also were both very different from each other. How were they different from each other? You see, Russia or the Soviet Union was a spreader of communist ideology. And Americans, on the other hand, were the spreaders of capitalist ideology. Capitalism means free market system. Communism means state-led control in the development of the economy. Both of them had different approaches to their development. Both of them had different approaches to the idea in which they wanted to basically control their societies. While Americans were champions of democracy, there was no such case in the case of Soviet Union. They preferred dictators. So one thing became very clear, that as US and Russia decided not to fight militarily, they decided to fight ideologically. And this ideological battle now was fought between Russia and US as a battle of communism and capitalism. Now the question is, you see, it is very easy to fight militarily. If Russia and US are two superpowers, if they both militarily fight, what will happen eventually? One will get defeated, one will become victorious. Whichever power is victorious, that power can claim victory and say that I have won the war. But the problem is, how do you fight ideologically? Ideology is what, sir? Ideology is basically a state of mind. Ideology is not something that you have on a platter. So how do you fight ideologically? The best way to fight ideologically is to do what? Is to basically create a culture of followership. देखो, इंडिया में जो आज की डेट में भक्त कल्चर पाया जा रहा है, that Bhakt culture has its ironical origin during the Cold War only. If you see, Russia and US said कि भाई, if we are not going to fight militarily, we are going to fight ideologically. And how we fight ideologically? By having more followers. So what did Russia say? Russia said a simple thing. Russia said कि see, my ideology is communism. If I start marketing communism, and if I am able to convince countries in the world to follow communism, and if more and more countries follow communist principles, what will eventually happen? Eventually, I will succeed in creating a world which will be dominated by communist countries. And if the number of countries in the world, Russia thought, are more communist and less capitalist, it means communism dominates. And if communism dominates, automatically Russia dominates. If Russia had this thought, the beauty is US also had the same thought. US said ki bhai, my ideology is what? Capitalism. If US now started saying that if I start marketing capitalism, and if I start marketing capitalism to different countries and tell those different countries to become capitalist, then what will happen? By doing good marketing, if I am able to sell them the idea of being capitalist, and if the countries become capitalist, what will happen? These countries which eventually become capitalist will create a situation in the world in a future where number of countries in the world which are capitalist will become more than the countries which are communist. And obviously, if number of capitalist countries in the world grow, capitalism dominates, and if capitalism dominates, indirectly US dominates. So one thing is very clear, that as the World War II ended, the world entered into a Cold War. The Cold War was basically an ideologically divided world. The ideologies were two: the communist ideology, the capitalist ideology. The communist ideology became one pole and capitalist ideology became another pole. So the world basically had two dominant poles. The two dominant poles were capitalist and communist poles. So the world can also be stated not only ideologically divided, but world having two poles means that the world was bipolar, where the word bi means two, polar means poles, and two poles are basically communist and capitalist poles. So basically, our final observation here is that when the World War II ended, the world witnessed an ideologically divided world. World basically was a bipolar world, and this bipolar world was basically a world where we had a Cold War going on. A Cold War going on means that countries were basically led by Russia and US, which were ideologically divided, and as a result of which, one thing became very clear, that there was no military confrontation happening, but ideological clash happening. Now, it is in this backdrop that India as a country was born in 1947. Now, you see, when India was born in 1947 in the Cold War, what were the policy options before India at that time, at the time of independence? The first policy option for India at the time of independence was that India at that time could either join the capitalist bloc of the world, that is, join the Americans. The other option for India was that it could have joined the communist bloc, that means the bloc of the Russians. Now, India at that time was led by Nehru. Nehru at that time said that, the policy choices before India at that time are that we can either join the communists or the capitalists. Nehru basically undertook a discussion. The discussion was that what are the implications of the existing policy choices that we have. The first policy choice is that we can be a, say, capitalist. We can join the Americans and we can be a part of the American system of the capitalism. Nehru said, what will happen if we join the capitalists? He said, if we join the capitalists, one thing will become clear, that if we join the American system, the US will tell us at that time, as a capitalist ally, what kind of economic policy to follow. And if India joins capitalism as a policy choice, US will convince and compel India to become a capitalist country. And if US compels India to become a capitalist country, does India have any independence in deciding its own economic policy? Answer is no. If India does not have its independence in deciding its own economic policy, then that means that there is a loss of independence in decision making at the economic level. Similarly, Nehru said that if we join US again, or the capitalism system again, not only US will decide our economic policy, US will also decide our military policy. US will also decide our foreign policy. Because once you are an ally of the capitalists, the capitalists will basically try to control your economic, military, and foreign policy. But Nehru said ki the beauty is that the same problem exists if we join even the communists. That even if we join hands with the Russians, Russians will also basically, number one, try to decide our economic policy, try to decide our foreign policy, try to decide our basically military policy. So Nehru said ki by allowing somebody else like Russians or US to take decisions for our policies, we will lose the space to undertake independent decision making. And such a loss of independent decision making power will also negate our past. Now, why did Nehru say negate our past? One thing is very clear. What was India's past just prior to independence? India was a colony of the British. Why did India fight the British? India fought the British because it's not that India disliked the British. We disliked the fact that the Britishers did not give India the independence to take our own decisions. We fought the British because we wanted to take decisions on our economic, military, and foreign policy on our own independently. That was the sole objective of the Indian national movement also. So one thing became very clear, that the loss of independence in decision making and negation of the past, negation of our entire freedom struggle would have happened had we joined either of the two blocks which were available at that time. So India basically under Nehru at that time very clearly stated that number one, we have to respect our past. Our past is that we fought a freedom struggle against the British for almost 150 years. And that freedom struggle that we fought against the British was solely to get independence in decision making. So we have to respect our past. We have to undertake decisions in a very clear-cut defined space so that India can manifest its rightful destiny in the world at that time. So when Nehru said all this, it became very clear that what India is likely to adopt as a policy choice. So India at that time very clearly under Nehru stated that we are not going to align to either the US or to the USSR, and we are going to remain what is called as non-aligned. And when Nehru said that we are going to remain non-aligned, he very clearly stated the meaning of non-alignment. He said that the meaning of non-alignment is that we are going to engage with the US, we are going to engage with the USSR, we are not going to upset the US, we are not going to upset the USSR, and we will not only diplomatically engage with US or USSR, but also economically and politically engage with them. So idea of Nehru's non-alignment was very clear, sir. The idea of non-alignment was, in a simple language, I repeat again, engage with everybody and upset nobody. So non-alignment did not mean that we will not engage with anybody. Non-alignment only meant that we will not align, we will not join. We will not join the US bloc, we will not join the Russia bloc. And why we will not join the US or Russia bloc? Because three things. We need space for autonomy. Because we want to take decisions independently. And we want to take decisions independently based on our national interest. So one thing is very clear, sir, that when India said we are going to remain non-aligned, India at that time maintained very clearly that by being non-aligned, it means that we will engage with everybody, we will upset nobody, but we will not align with anybody. So please be very careful to understand this. Non-alignment only means that we are not going to align with US and USSR. Non-alignment means we will engage with US, we will engage with USSR. And we will engage with other countries who are also allies of US and also countries which are allies of USSR. So non-alignment is only non-alignment with the two blocks. Non-alignment is not non-engagement. So don't confuse the two. These are technical things you have to be very clear about. And why was non-alignment important for us? Non-alignment was important because by remaining non-aligned, we would have the space to take our decisions independently. By remaining non-aligned, we could take a call based on our own autonomy on whom to engage with and which country will help us to basically achieve our national interest. If my national interest gets achieved better by engaging with US, I will engage with US. If my national interest is better achieved by engaging with USSR, I will engage with USSR. But the primacy for national interest and the decision to decide with whom I will engage to achieve my national interest will rest with me only. Nobody can tell me what to do. I have the sense and the capability to decide what to do. So as this idea of being non-aligned was born, over a period of time, this idea was also promoted by Nehru to other countries. He told many other countries who were gaining independence at that time at the end of the World War II that they should also remain non-aligned. So personal efforts of Nehru, in a simple language, to do marketing of the idea of non-alignment, enabled the birth of a movement called non-aligned movement. So by 1961, we were in the world witnessing a full-fledged movement called as a non-aligned movement. And this non-aligned movement was not a challenger to the existing bipolar world. The idea of remaining non-aligned was just an orientation in foreign policy. An orientation in foreign policy where countries decided that they will maintain their independence and autonomy in engaging with others and will engage with others on the basis of their national interest. But they will not align with anybody. So one thing became very clear, that by 1961, the idea of remaining non-aligned eventually manifested as a non-aligned movement also. Now, if we look at the India's foreign policy under non-alignment era, there are 5 problems that we need to briefly keep in mind. This is just a passing reference to all these problems. They will help you to put the foreign policy in a context. You see, after India became independent, the first problem that India had at that time was that there was a dilemma that India witnessed, that whether it should develop economically or militarily. At that time, India said that if I develop economically, what will happen? If I develop economically, I will be able to prosper. If I create industries, I will be able to utilize the money that I generate from those industries by manufacturing products and use that money to create more industries. But India also had another option, that it could also at that time after independence focus all its priorities to become a military power. India said, ki see, I have just now become independent. Nehru said, ki bhai, we have just now become independent, we have very limited money with us. And because we have very limited money with us, we can either prioritize that money towards economy or we can prioritize that money towards military. Nehru at that time undertook again a discussion. The discussion now was that if we try to develop ourselves as a military power, what will be the consequence? Nehru said that the consequence of we trying to develop ourselves as a military power would be very simple. The consequence would be that we will have a strong military but a poor economy. And a country with a strong military and a poor economy in the long run will not be able to succeed, as such a model is not a sustainable model. But Nehru said on the other hand that if we focus on economy, where focus on economy is more, while parallelly we develop the military, it becomes a more sustainable model. So Nehru at that time, after undertaking a lot of discussion, solved the problem number 1. He said, we have to prioritize our resources appropriately. How do we prioritize our resources appropriately? Nehru said very simply that if we have 100 rupees, for example, we will put 70 rupees to develop the economy. Why? Because economy is a force multiplier. What is a force multiplier? Force multiplier means that if I have 100 rupees and if I use 70 rupees to develop an industry or create an industry, then using that industry, I can undertake development of products. I can sell those products and further make more money out of it. So you see, by undertaking one limited investment of 70 rupees in economy, I am able to multiply my investment. So that is why economic investments are always called force multipliers. So Nehru said it's all about prioritization. we will prioritize economy over military. We will prioritize economy over military in this manner that I will give 70 rupees to develop economy, 30 rupees to develop the military. Number one. Number two, frontier problem with the Chinese and the two-phase solution leading to the 1962. You see, we are just going to make a passing reference here. For further details, if you are interested, please read the India and China chapter where the border problem is discussed in great detail, along with the recent Ladakh standoff, that why it happened, how it happened, and what is the future of that. You will be able to get clarity. But let us briefly keep this in mind. You know, when the Britishers were in India, Britishers created a natural boundary with China. What is a natural boundary? A natural boundary is a boundary where physical features on the ground are used as a border. What are physical features which are used there as a border? For example, physical features like mountains, lakes, rivers, streams, valleys, they are basically used as border markers. So the reason why the Britishers basically maintained a natural border with the Chinese is basically because the Chinese were never a threat to the British. The Chinese were always a middle kingdom that were busy in their own activities. As they never tried to threaten the British and their sovereignty over India directly, the Britishers, number one, preferred to maintain a natural border with the Chinese. But that does not mean that the Britishers never took any efforts to solve the border. They did take a lot of efforts, whether it was the Shimla Convention, McMahon Line, etc. Or even before the McMahon Line, there was a McCartney-MacDonald Line, and prior to that, there was a Johnson Line, 1865 also. All those things are given in the India-China chapter. You can have a reading of that if you are interested in the chronology and all. So Britishers did try to take the efforts, but even if those efforts were not very fruitful, they never acted as a threat to the British Empire also. Now, the Britishers left India in 1947. At that time in 1947, when the Britishers left us, China was having a civil war. You know, a civil war is a war which happens between the political groups within the country. War externally happens between two countries. A sub-aspect of war is a term that we discussed last time also in the previous webinar. A sub-aspect of war is called civil war. In a civil war, what happens is that there are two political groups that fight within the country. And if two political groups fight within the country, there is a civil war. So China was witnessing a civil war when India became independent. Chinese civil war ended in 1949, 2 years after we became independent. So in 1949, the People's Republic of China was born, PRC. At that time in 1949, China and India sat together to discuss about the border. The point number one of the discussion that they had to do was that what do we do about this border? We have a border which has been created by the British, which is a natural border. Should we continue with this natural border or should we go for a fresh border? So that was the first point of discussion. This discussion started from 1949, continued till 1954. In 1954, the first phase of the talks between India-China came to an end. By 1954, there was a discussion which was very clear between the two parties, India and China, that there is a natural boundary between India and China. That natural boundary should be removed and there should be a proper border. So there was a consensus in the first phase of talks. First phase of talks is from 1949 to 1954. The discussion in the first phase of talks is what? The discussion is that whether we should continue with the British-made natural border or no. What is the conclusion of the talks? The conclusion is natural border should not be continued. There has to be a properly demarcated border. So that is what the consensus was achieved at. Now number two, the discussion entered into the second phase. In the second phase, the discussion was that how do we demarcate the border? The discussion that started from 1955 onwards continued till 1961. From 1955 to 1961, the discussion was that how do we demarcate the fresh border? Now, during this period, India at that time showed China their maps. And India told China, ki China, see, according to our maps, we believe that the border should be here. During those discussions, China showed us their maps. China said, ki no, India, according to our maps, which are our own historical maps, we believe that the border should be here. The discussion continued, but there was no consensus. By the time it was 1960, it had been 5 years since both the parties were talking to each other. And for the last 5 years, both the parties were not able to develop a consensus that whose maps are right. and both the parties were not able to develop a consensus that according to whose maps should we try to basically demarcate the border. So one thing became very clear, that as the consensus could not be developed by 1960, both the parties became very insecure. By 1960-61, India started thinking that China is not interested in solving the border, and they are more interested in imposing their version of border upon us. While India developed this thought, ironically at that time even China developed the same thinking. China also said that India is not serious in solving the border. China said that not only India is not serious in solving the border, they said that we believe that India wants to impose their version of border upon us. So one thing became very clear, that both the parties developed a lot of insecurity. This insecurity was because of not having clarity as to whose maps on the border are right that can help us to solve the border. And as the two parties became insecure, this insecurity led to a clash in 1962. And if you remember, in the previous lecture I told you one thing, that a conflict which happens because of difference of opinion. And in 1962, India and China also had a conflict precisely because of a difference of opinion over the border. And the difference of opinion over the border was that whose maps are right. Both the parties never had the clarity. So one thing is very clear, that India and China had a difference of opinion with respect to the border, and the difference of opinion was that whose maps are right, as none of the parties were able to develop adequate clarity through discussion as to whose maps are right. Both the parties were unable to eventually achieve a consensus, and this difference of opinion led to a violent clash in 1962. This violent clash lasted only for around 22 days. After 22 days, the violent clash came to an end. But, after this violent clash, one thing became very clear. The matter still never got resolved. The matter still is continuously being discussed even till today. But after the 1962 India-China boundary clash, which happened because of difference of opinion over the boundary, India realized at that time that, when we had this conflict with China, at that time, we were not able to adequately respond to China. And we were not adequately prepared even at the military level to respond to China aggressively. So India began to introspect why. India began to introspect that why were we not able to respond adequately to China at that time. So one thing became very clear. On introspection, India found that one reason why we were not adequately able to respond to China is because our military was not adequately developed. And one reason why India realized that its military was not adequately developed is because of the point number one, the problem number one in the slide, if you go back to. The problem number one, that is prioritization of economy over military. So what had India done? Nehru had decided that if I have 100 rupees, 70 rupees I'll use to develop economy and 30 for military. After 1962 border clash with China, India understood one thing, that with 30 rupees I cannot develop my military adequately. And with 30 rupees, if I keep on giving that much amount to my military will take a long amount of time to develop. And I cannot afford to wait for such a long time, considering that China is a hostile power. I am surrounded with this hostile power. So India after 1962 decided to undertake a rectification. India said that my faulty prioritization led to the 1962. I will rectify the problem. So in order to rectify the problem, India now started saying two things. First thing India said after 1962 conflict is that we will give equal priority to economic development and military development. What did India say? We will give equal priority to economic and military development. And number two, India said that at the same time, if I have 100 rupees, I will prioritize 50 rupees to develop my economy and 50 rupees to develop my military. So one thing became very clear, that India said that if I have 100 rupees, 50 rupees now for economy, 50 rupees for military. So India began to, number one, undertake military modernization. The military modernization was now done primarily with the objective of rectifying the faulty prioritization, and as a result of which, India was able to channelize adequate resources to develop its military and began the military modernization as such. But as India started doing this military modernization after 1962, and as we began to modernize our military by engaging with the Russians, what happened at that time was that in 1964 Nehru also died. Now, after the death of Nehru, Lal Bahadur Shastri became the next prime minister. Now, when Shastri became the prime minister, Shastri ji was a very great domestic leader. He was a very popular domestic person. But internationally, he did not obviously enjoy the same image as Nehru had enjoyed. Because Nehru was basically the India's first prime minister at a very crucial stage in the history of the world also. So one thing became very clear, that when Shastri became the prime minister, our neighbor Pakistan began to perceive that Shastri ji is a weak leader. Pakistan also thought that just now in 1962 India has been basically defeated by China, whereas in a conflict nobody gets ever defeated as such. But Pakistan perceived that no, the Chinese had basically defeated the Indians. So Pakistan began to contemplate. The contemplation was that India has a weak leadership led by Shastri, plus India's military is not adequately modernized also. So Pakistan at that time in 1965 thought that this is the best time for us to attack India, as they are very weak leadership wise, domestically and militarily, and take advantage of their weakness and basically grab huge amount of territory in Kashmir. But this eventually was a Pakistani miscalculation, and Pakistan in 1965 basically tried to incite violence. They tried to attack India. When they tried to attack India, India basically declared war because India's sovereignty was violated by Pakistan. And when India declared war on Pakistan, one thing now became very clear, that India gave a very strong response militarily to Pakistan. And that strong response that we gave militarily to Pakistan came as a surprise to Pakistan also. कि ये कैसे हो गया? But ये तो होना ही था बेटा, पिटना था ही तूने. One thing is very clear, that one reason why this happened is primarily because since 1962, after the India-China border clash, India had started military modernization. Even by 1965, if our military was not fully modernized, our military at least was partially modernized enough. And our military was partially modernized enough to give a strong response to this ancient and archaic army of Pakistan at least. So one thing became very clear, that in 1965, Pakistan got a strong response and was basically eventually at that time decimated badly by India. But after 1965, one thing became very clear, that India realized that this Pakistan state is a menace to me. And the reason why it is a menace to me is that it does not want to live peacefully, it wants to just keep on troubling us. So we have to teach Pakistan a lesson. Now, the situation again was that as the time progressed after 1965, India was very clear in mind that Pakistan should definitely be taught a lesson once and for all, so that their territorial aggression over Kashmir doesn't occur. As the time progressed, again in 1970s, certain events occurred. We don't need to go into the historical aspects of those events because normally we study them when we study India and Bangladesh relations. But again, certain events occurred. And as a result of which in 1971, Pakistan again eventually attacked India because of those reasons. And as a result of those events which motivated Pakistan to attack us, one thing now became very clear, that as Pakistan attacked India again decided to retaliate to Pakistan in 1971. And this time when we retaliated to Pakistan in 1971, one thing became very clear, that this time we gave a strong response to Pakistan by undertaking dismemberment of Pakistan, or undertaking what is also known as vivisection of Pakistan. Vivisection means territorially breaking them. So in 1971, as a strong response of the Indian side, East Pakistan was basically sliced off, and as a result of which an independent country called Bangladesh was created there. So one thing now became very clear, that in 1971, India again gave militarily a very strong response to Pakistan. This 1971 response that we gave to them led to the birth of an era of dominance in Indian foreign policy. And by 1971, India was also able to officially assert to everybody in the world that now our military is modernized. And it's very important to keep one thing in mind, that through the 1971 incident, India also tried, by not only giving a strong response to Pakistan, but through 1971, India also communicated an indirect message to China. And India indirectly in 1971 communicated this to China, कि China, Now, what we have done in 1971 should inform you that our military is not the same as it was in 1962. And our response was very clear that China, if you try to do a 1962 again, then you may end up in losing Tibet and Tibet may become a part of Himachal Pradesh, then don't complain to us. So one thing became very clear, that eventually era of dominance in the Indian foreign policy began. So this is how India's foreign policy briefly manifested and worked around in the era of non-alignment. However, in 1989, the Soviet Union began to disintegrate. You see, Soviet Union was basically a union of Russia and 15 other countries. All those 15 other countries and Russia were bound together, constituting the Soviet Union at that time. However, controlling those 15 countries became very difficult for the Russians. And by 1989, most of those countries began to assert independence. And as they asserted independence, the Soviet Union began to disintegrate. And as the Soviet Union disintegrated, Russia began to disintegrate. The bipolar world shifted to become a unipolar world. What is a unipolar world? A unipolar world was a world where only one pole was left. And that one pole that was left was basically the US. Why was a unipolar world created? Unipolar world got created primarily because Russia disintegrated. Now when Russia disintegrated at the end of the Cold War, there was a rise of a unipolar world. So the rise of a unipolar world gave US tremendous amount of power in the international system. So one thing became very clear, that when the Cold War ended in 1989. The Cold War ended in 1989, we say, because Russia began to disintegrate in 1989. The disintegration of Russia, which began from 1989, continued till 1991. By 1991, one thing became very clear, that the world basically was no more bipolar, but there was a rise of a unipolar world. So for some years, from 1991, the world was unipolar. That means there was only one pole in the world with nobody to challenge that pole, and that pole was basically the US. But over a period of time, one thing now became very clear, that the world which was initially unipolar gradually began to become multipolar. What is a multipolar world? A multipolar world is a world where there are multiple powers. If you remember, in the previous webinar, I told you about the polarity thesis. In the polarity thesis, we have a unipolar, bipolar, multipolar world. Today, the world is a multipolar world. Over a period of time, we have seen there is a decline in the US power. And the decline in the US power has happened because of USA's ability to control the behavior of the states in the world declining. So today, US is no more that powerful a country as it was at one point of time. Today there are challengers to the US in the international system. One of the challengers is India also, one of the challengers is China also, one of the challengers is France also. So there have been multiple challengers to the Americans, as a result of which one thing is that the world is today multipolar. But now, as far as India's foreign policy is concerned, what is the relevance of non-alignment? The relevance of non-alignment today is that in the era of the post-Cold War period today, non-alignment may not be relevant anymore. Why? Because non-alignment was basically created by India to manage and wade through the Cold War period. But the Cold War period is over. Today the world is a multipolar world, and Indian foreign policy also believes in a multipolar world. So what is the relevance of non-alignment? The relevance of non-alignment is that as an idea, it remains relevant till today, but in a different manner. And that different manner is that today we do not use the term non-alignment anymore, primarily because the word non-alignment has been used during the Cold War. But we use the essence of the non-alignment today under a different word which is called the strategic autonomy. You see, let me tell you one very basic thing here, that as per Hindu mythology, basically what happens in Hindu mythology is that they believe that if a person dies, only the person's body is dead, the soul remains alive. This is what the Hindu mythology believes in. And because the Hindu mythology believes that if a person dies, only the person's body is dead while the soul remains alive, it is the same lens that we have to use to now view non-alignment today. While non-alignment may be dead, because non-alignment was a tool used by India during Cold War, but the soul of non-alignment, the spirit of non-alignment continues to remain alive. And what is that spirit of non-alignment? The spirit of non-alignment are the same three things that we had earlier, that we used during the Cold War. Number one, autonomy. Number two, independence. Number three, national interest. And these three things, which were the spirit of non-alignment, that means that we will take decisions independently, we will take decisions on the basis of our own autonomy, we will engage with countries in the world based on our national interest, all today constitute the strategic autonomy today. So while India may not use the term non-alignment anymore today, the principle of the non-alignment, the spirit of the non-alignment today is basically used by India under a term called strategic autonomy. So today, Indian foreign policy, we say number one stands for a multipolar world. Number two, we say Indian foreign policy stands for strategic autonomy today. So what is the meaning of the word strategic autonomy? It is the same thing as what was the meaning of the spirit of non-alignment. Not non-alignment per se, but the spirit of non-alignment. And what is the spirit of non-alignment? Three things: independence, autonomy, national interest. And what is the spirit of strategic autonomy? Same three things: independence, autonomy, national interest. So one thing is very clear here, that over a period of time, India has continued to believe that it will focus on a multipolar world. Number one. Number two, India has very clearly stated that even though non-alignment may be dead, the relevance of non-alignment is that the spirit of non-alignment continues to remain alive and continues to guide our foreign policy today. And the spirit of non-alignment that continues to guide us today is basically called strategic autonomy. So strategic autonomy, once again I repeat, is nothing but the spirit of non-alignment, and the same spirit of non-alignment continues to guide the foreign policy behavior of India today. So keeping this in mind, now we conclude the presentation, and let us now have a look at the question answer session. So as we basically move to the question answer session, there have been a lot of questions of students. Let me now try answering them. Okay, so as we observe, one of the first questions that has come here is that what is the difference between two nations of the same ideology? Now this question itself is framed wrong. There is nothing called like, difference between two nations of same ideology. If they are nations of same ideology, they are ideologically called the similar nations only. Similarly, now you see, we don't need to enter into the debate that whether India joining capitalist or India joining socialist was right or not. That depends upon the question that the examiner gives us to answer, and based upon the question, that if we have to take a stand, we can take a stand based upon the facts which are available. Now there is one very important question here, that are autonomy and independence not the same? The answer is to some extent yes, they are same. But when we look at the principle of non-alignment, the autonomy here that we are referring to in non-alignment is basically the space of independence in decision making that we are looking at. So please be careful about that. That autonomy with respect to non-alignment here is similar to independence, but it broadly refers to the space that we are referring to. Now there is a question about probable questions. The probable questions related to what we have discussed today are already given in the book, and they are given at the end of section 2 and section 3. You can have a look at the questions there. There are 10 questions at the end of the two sections. They can help you to understand what is the nature of questions there. Similarly, for example, there is another question that what is a hot war? Hot war is basically when the Cold War becomes hot, when there is a military confrontation on the ground. So 1971 is a hot war. 1965 is a hot war. So when there is a war that happens, it is basically a hot war. when there is an urge to fight which happens, which is there, when there is an urge to fight, that urge to fight ideologically is basically Cold War. So fine, I think most of the questions there are almost repetitive in nature only, and I have been able to answer those questions. So we can end the webinar here right now, and next time, next Friday, we shall be meeting with the next topic, and we shall be discussing the next topic at that time. Thank you.